In this video, we'll create a transparent HTML login form. So let's take a look at it here before we get started with the tutorial. So if we take a look at the top of our login form, we have a user image here, followed by the enter email field. And if we don't put a proper email in, we're going to get a pop-up saying that it's not a correct email. Then in the password field here for our input section, when we enter our characters, they're going to be encrypted there. And then beneath that, we have our login button here, followed by the forgot password button. Let's go ahead and size the screen down. So when we get to 576 pixels, it's going to take up 100% of the screen, and anything over that, it's going to take up 9/12 of the screen. So it's about 2/3 or just above it. Okay, so in the description of this video will be the transparent HTML login form starter files here, where you'll find index.html and style.css. I'm going to be using the free program called Sublime Text as my text editor, and then I'm also going to have index.html open with Google Chrome while we're laying out our login form. Also included in the starter files will be both images, the user face image here, as well as the hallway background image. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and put this aside, and let's take a look at our files here, starting with index.html to see what's already included for us. So from the top of our document, we have our doc type HTML, then our HTML tag, and inside of the head section we have our title, followed by the latest version of Bootstrap CSS, the latest version of jQuery, then Popper.js, which is recommended for Bootstrap. Then we have Bootstrap 4 JS here, and then lastly inside of our head section we have a link to style.css. So let's check out style.css because we already have the background image here included for us, as well as a font family designated from Google Fonts, which is already imported for us. Okay, so let's move back over to index.html and we'll get started with our form. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to wrap the actual content of the form with a div class called modal dialog. So div class modal dialog, and then our text will also be centered throughout the form other than the placeholder text. So we'll use text-center here as a class, and Bootstrap will take care of centering the text for us. Okay, so we can go ahead and close out the div. And the next thing that we'll add will be our Bootstrap column class here. So we'll say col sm9, and then we'll give it a class that says main section. So we'll use 9 of 12 columns for our width, and it's going to change to that after 576 pixels. Okay, inside of that we'll have our actual modal content div class, where we'll start to see the form, or the shape of the form, I should say. So there, if we refresh, we have the start of our modal content. Okay, so let's go ahead and add the first bit of our content, which will be the user image. So we'll say div class col12 because we're going to use up all 12 columns inside of the actual modal, and then we'll just say user-image as our class for the image so we can reference it later in the CSS. And now we'll want to reference the face.png image. So we'll say image source img / for the image folder, and then face.png. Okay, so now if we go and refresh in Google Chrome, there we have the face image inside of our modal content class. So now let's go ahead and add the first bits of our actual form. So we'll say div class col12, and then form-input, and then we can close out the div, and inside of this div we'll have our actual form. Okay, so let's start off with our first form group here for the email input. So div class form group, and then close out the div, and then we'll add our input with input type email, and then class form-control. And then for our placeholder text, you can write what you like, but I'm just going to keep it the same as the original with enter email. Okay, so let's refresh, and there we have our first input section. So let's go ahead and add our enter password section. So we'll add another div class form group, and then inside of our div we'll have our input section, so input type password, and then once again class form control, and then placeholder enter password. And then remember to close out the div for the form group class. Okay, so there we have our password input field, and now to complete the actual form we'll need our submit button. So we'll drop down underneath the form group div class and write button, and we'll say button type submit, and then class btn, and then we'll just write login here for our button text. Okay, so there we have the start of our button. And then lastly, for our HTML, we have the forgot password section. So let's drop down underneath the form input class, and we'll say div class col 12 for all 12 columns of our modal content, and then class forgot. And then we'll just have our link here. So ahref, I'll leave it blank, and then forgot password question mark. Okay, so if we refresh, there we have our forgot password link, and that's everything for the HTML portion of the tutorial. So let's move over to style.css, and we'll get started from the top of our form with the main section class. So what we'll want to do is center the form on the page. So let's use margin 0 auto to center it. And let's add some padding, or margin rather, to the top. So we'll say margin top 150 pixels. So now if we refresh, we have it pretty much centered on the page here. So let's add our background color next. So we'll want to reference the modal content to be inside of the actual modal. So modal content, and then background color 000 for black. And there we have our black background, but we want it to be transparent. So we'll say opacity 0.5. And you can mess with the opacity to get the transparency that you want. And then we'll also want to have some padding off to the sides so the input fields don't take up so much of the width of our modal. So we'll say padding 0 top bottom, 20 pixels left right. Okay, so that looks pretty good. So next, let's go ahead and resize the user image there. So we'll want to reference the user image class that we created here and the actual image to change the size. So .user-img, img, open and close your brackets, and then we'll give it a height and width of 120 pixels. Okay, so now if we refresh, there we have it, the same size as the original, but we want to pull it upward outside of the top of our modal content class. So we'll say user-image, margin top, -60 pixels, which will be 50% of the image. Okay, and then let's add some margin to the bottom to separate it from our form group. So margin bottom 30 pixels. Okay, so that looks pretty good. So next, let's add some margin between the actual form groups, of which we have 2. So we'll say .form-group, and then margin bottom 30 pixels. Okay, so that looks good. And then let's change the input placeholder text here. because it's a little light right now. So I want to reference the input and the placeholder, which is inside of the actual form group. So form group input placeholder. And we'll just need a double colon to reference the placeholder text there. So let's change the color to black from the gray shade, and let's make the font size a little larger at 18 pixels. And then to match the original, let's space out our characters a little bit with letter spacing 1 pixel. Okay, so that looks pretty good. So let's move down to our login button next. So we'll reference the actual button tag before we go to the button class. So that's going to be a form input button. So dot form dash input button, and let's change the width to 60%. And let's add some margin to the bottom of it to separate it from the forgot password area. So margin bottom 30 pixels. Okay. So now let's go ahead and style the actual button with the btn class. So we'll say .btn, and let's change the background color to black with the hex value 000, and the actual color of the text to white with FFF. And then we'll want to have a perimeter to it with a border. So let's say border 2 pixels solid FFF. Okay, so that looks good. And then let's make our text a little bit larger, which will enlarge the actual button also. So font size 20 pixels. And then the original, similar to the placeholder text, has some additional letter spacing. So letter spacing 1 pixel. Okay, so that looks pretty good. So next, let's go ahead and add our hover effect to the button. So we'll say btn:hover, and let's change the background color to a gray shade with 666, and then let's keep the border at 2 pixels solid white. So it's not going to look gray with the opacity. It's going to be kind of an off-white sort of gray, or light gray rather than a solid gray. Next, let's go ahead and just add a little bit of margin to the bottom of the forgot class for our forgot password section. So I'll say .forgot margin bottom 30 pixels. And then let's make that text white. And we'll get rid of the or actually we don't need to get rid of any underlining with it. So that looks good. And then when we hover over it, we have an underline, but that's okay. Then the actual text here is kind of light when we enter text in here. So we'll want to reference the form control class to change the actual text that goes into the input section. So let's make it black, similar to the placeholder text. So .form-control color black, and it still looks gray here. So let's just say important. Okay, so there we have it. So now it's showing up nice and dark for us, so we're able to see our input text. Okay, so that does it. I want to thank you for sticking around with me through this tutorial. Please remember to like this video, subscribe, and turn on your notifications. Then I'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.